Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the launch of Words for a Dying World. My name's David from SCM Press, the publisher. We're going to be joined today by many of the voices that you'll find in the book, as well as Hannah herself, who's edited it, Hannah Malcolm. We're going to be hearing poetry from Julia Kendal, Azariah France-Williams, who have poems in the book. We're going to be hearing a performance from David Benjamin Blower, so some readings from the book from Hannah, and we also want to give plenty of time for conversation, so there'll be a good slot of time for some conversation. So we're thrilled to have Grace Thomas, Anderson Jeremiah, Sophia Chiron-Goma, Emma Leitz Bilekli, and Maria Andrade to join us, and Hannah Malcolm for a discussion a bit later on. And it goes without saying, of course, that there's a lot of technology involved here and a lot of people tuning in from a lot of different places because of how we've had to do this. So do bear with us if there's any technical problems along the way. We will get them sorted, but hopefully it'll all be fine. Also, just to say, there will be a chance to be involved in the panel discussion. You can use the comments section on YouTube. So do just use the comment section there, comments or question, and we can see those come up here. So we'll be able to see what you're saying. And also, if you're on Twitter, you might want to use a hashtag. I'd suggest hashtag WFADW. Which is a hashtag we've used on tweets as well. So if you're on Twitter, you'll see that, and do just join in the discussion. It'd be great to hear and just sort of provoke a bit of discussion around this. And then just the last bit of housekeeping. I'll mention this again at the end, but we're offering 20% off the book with free UK postage and packaging if you use the offer code WFADW20. Now we will put that in text at the end as we finish, so you'll see that again, but that's capital letters WFADW20. And if you type that in, you go to our website, scmpress.co.uk, you buy a copy of the book, and then as you check out, you can type in that code and it should give you a discount. So do look out for that. That'll work until I think the end of this month, January. So before we hear from our first contributors this evening, I just wanted to say a couple of words about the book. Because Words for a Dying World is a fairly unique project. I don't think I've ever been involved in a book quite like this one. In 2019, many of you will know, in 2019, Hannah Malcolm won our Theology Slam final with an absolutely stunning and moving talk on climate grief. Do after this, perhaps go and have a look. If you haven't seen it, have a look it up on YouTube, because it's an amazing talk. And she talks about this notion of solastalgia. And I think from the feedback and the coverage we had afterwards, it seemed clear that this way of thinking about grief and climate and this idea of homesickness struck a chord with people. And so as we sort of wrapped that up, I asked Hannah if she felt there was any book in there linked to that idea. And she was really clear. What she wanted to do was pull together actually multiple voices and multiple experiences, and reflect on the everyday lived reality of grief in a changing climate. And so what she pulled together was something I think quite amazing. It's a book that's sometimes painful, sometimes disturbing, and moving, but it's also profoundly hopeful, I think. So often collections like this are less than the sum of their parts, but this book actually works quite differently. It's quite a sort of a visceral experience reading it. There's a lot of yourself, a lot of seeing, feeling, hearing involved, and experiencing, as each contributor brings something of their own context, whether that be the parched landscape of Australia devastated by forest fires, or the struggles for land rights in Namibia. And there are lots of images as well. I'm really struck by the use of image throughout the book. So there's things like that in a chapter by Victoria Marie. There's an eagle's nest in a metal cage. There's in Kyle Lamberlay's chapter just an oil check that his grandmother has been receiving. Just little moments like that are extraordinarily powerful, and I think the result is this kind of journey with the contributors through lament and to hope. Actually, Chiney MacDonald has expressed this much better than I could really. She says in her endorsement on the back of the book, she says it's a tapestry of voices of lament and hope, breaking your heart before piecing it back together and pointing the way forward. So I guess in sum, I kind of hope that we get a little bit of a glimpse of that tonight. If you've not read the book, it might just give you a little bit of a flavour of how that all works. But so as we go on, I'm going to hand over now to Julia, and she's going to be sharing just one of the poems for the book, and then Azariah is also going to be sharing a poem for us as well. Julia.
Hi, good evening. The poem I'm going to perform tonight is called Overdue, and through it I was trying to capture something of the grief of being someone who's been working on and thinking about climate change for quite a while, and having felt like a bit of an outlier in society and quite isolated through that, and how in recent years, particularly in the UK where I'm based, we've seen it become much more mainstream, and that should be a moment of real joy, but has brought a different kind of grief, a sense that it's a bit too late for the world sometimes, but also a bit too late for ourselves as we've felt isolated. So that was the feeling that I was trying to capture through this poem. Keep your words, stuff them down the back of your throat, where I have learned to swallow mine, scraped, raw, but never quite deep enough to spit them out. A bit too late for ourselves. The last 5 minutes of the radio, television, found an article in a tattered corner of the internet. Echo back at me the words I am struggling to digest for years, as if this is my first taste. Stomach churns on shadows that never set. Chatter through calamity while someone passes the salt. Display the speck of dirt under your own nails. Pristine oblivion that too closely mirrors my own. Ears drown in my own screams, full to yours. I offer only silence, maybe because it's all I received. That or a polite nod that recognized truth but left it standing at the door. So this is a self-taught tightrope walk, rigid to the rules, broken in the moment, gracelessly falling. How can I offer what I never gave myself? Clattering, golden mean mist again. Wasn't this what I wanted? To be met in the conversation? But I've long slipped from my seat. I tried years ago. Now feels too late. Thank you for listening. I'm going to hand over now to Azariah.
You're on mute, Azariah, on mute.
Thank you. In 2019, September, I went to an event thinking about the climate in Cambridge. I was there, I was invited by the Amos Trust to be there as a poet to capture what was happening, and lectures, the talks, the presentations that were being shared. And for me, this was an induction into something I'd been aware of, but something I didn't know that much about. I was there. There's someone else who's involved later, David Benjamin Blower, and I remember sitting and just talking through a number of the poems with him as they came. There was such a coalition of people there. There was Amos Trust, there was Greenpeace, there was A Rocha, there was Tear Fund, there was Christian Climate Action, there was Extinction Rebellion, there was Hope for the Future, there was Christian Aid, Climate Stewards, and others, all working together, all coming together for the sake of our species, for the sake of our planet, and for the sake of the world. And in one of those sessions, someone got up and spoke about a protest and how she stood in front of the police and she shouted to them, "This is not a riot. It's a funeral." And that really got to me. And this poem called Endings is what emerged from me considering her words. Close the maternity wards. Open up more dementia centres. Let us forget, lest we remember. Remember the passion, the fire, now an ember, the mass movement obstructing of roads, the power of play, frightening the riot police away. This is not a riot, one woman stood to say. It's a funeral. We mourn, no sunshine today. But can we climb out of the cold grave, dug by greed's rant and rave? Will humanity rediscover some vital connection? Will we have a resurrection? Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining for this launch of Words for a Dying World. It's a real privilege to share with you some of the voices from the collection. Before we go into a longer time of discussion with some of the other contributors, having heard Azariah and Julia share their poetry, I'm going to read a short extract from the introduction to the book, which is entitled The End of the World. Depending on who you ask, the world began to end 10 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 250 years ago, or 400 years ago, depending on who you ask. Some have described this world ending as the Anthropocene, a term defining a new geological epoch dominated by human influence on climate and ecosystems. The precise beginning of the Anthropocene and the ending of the natural world is up for debate. Was it the early 17th century when European settlers killed so many Native Americans that global carbon dioxide levels hit a sudden low? Was it the Industrial Revolution, propelled by the labour of slaves and supercharging our greenhouse fate? Perhaps it is signified by a mega predatory slaughter of other species and the frightening acceleration of those institutions over the last 50 years. Philosopher Timothy Morton will tell you that the end of the world is an event that has already occurred twice. First in April 1784 with the invention of the steam engine, and again in 1945 when the first atom bomb was tested. Perhaps it is still ahead of us. Don't the headlines say we have 10 years left? This is a book about our relationships to these endings, what they signify and how we talk about them. The last 10 years has seen a sudden and rapidly growing interest in naming our experiences of climate breakdown, ecological collapse, and animal extinction. There has been an explosion in the number of people reporting grief, anxiety, and traumatic stress as a result of increased extreme weather events, the loss of flora and fauna, or a growing awareness of the existential threat that climate breakdown represents. These responses have been given various names, including but not limited to solastalgia, Tierra trauma, environmental melancholia, and climate or ecological grief, mourning, and anxiety. The diversity of terminology reflects the complexity of what we try to name. We are navigating the relationship between two constantly shifting concepts, human nature and non-human nature, and attempting to articulate a great trauma where that relationship does not simply shift, but ruptures, breaks, disintegrates. And descriptions of this trauma have only recently emerged in English, though they have a longer human history. Still, we try to talk about it. Of course, we must. But attempts to describe this relationship in light of climate and ecological breakdown tend either to romanticize the non-human, we need to learn from Mother Nature, flatten the obvious differences between humans and other creatures in order to emphasize similarities, we are nature defending itself, or demonize all human activity, humans are the virus. These approaches aren't necessarily all equally damaging, but they do share a common problem. They expand personal or cultural interpretations of the relationship between humans and other creatures into universal and universalizing claims. Mother Nature is comfortably claimed as a teacher when we do not live in fear of smallpox. We say that we are nature defending itself to decry littering while also promoting the nature transcending ethics of veganism. And it is very easy to claim that humans are the virus when no one is threatening to wipe out your particular group. Our grief about a dying world, however all-consuming it might feel, is not about death in abstraction. We grieve the death of particular things, whether creatures or places. And until we understand this, our relationship between others and ourselves, we will continue to flounder in slogans and simplifications.
So I think now we're going to have a chance to hear from each of or a few of the contributors to the book in a discussion, and Hannah is going to be sort of chairing that, so I'm going to hand over to them. They should appear soon on your screen.
Well, welcome everyone to this time of discussion. Have we got Sophia and Maria with us? And I think we that's great. And I think we've also still got both Davids on the screen.
Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nicola, for coordinating all this behind the scenes. We're going to have a time of discussion now, and hopefully this will be slightly more interactive for those of you who are watching. So please do write any questions you have for our panelists into the comments on YouTube. We can see those as they come in, so we'll be able to pick out a few to discuss. To start, though, I wonder if each of the panelists here could introduce yourselves. Just say who you are and what you do, and just briefly what your contribution to the book was about. We'll go in order of the people on the screen. So Emma, would you mind kicking us off?
Hello, my name is Emma Leitz-Balecki, and I work on a farm at Princeton Theological Seminary. My contribution to the book sort of speaks to that work with the soil in particular here, and sort of wrestling with the way that soil speaks to the past, what has happened, and also the way that it brings forth futures that are troubled. So thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Emma. Sophia, if we come to you next, if you could introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Sophia Chirongoma. I'm a feminist theologian from Africa, and I'm teaching at Midlands State University. I contributed a piece reflecting on how Cyclone Idai, which happened in Zimbabwe in March 2019, affected the community of Chimanimani and Chipinge. And as an African feminist theologian, my emphasis was on how about 80% of the people who either died or were injured were women and girls. And so I was reflecting on how the ecological crisis is mainly affecting the women and girls in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. Anderson, would you introduce yourself next?
Thank you. It's wonderful to be part of this panel. I'm based in Lancaster in the northwest of England. I teach in Lancaster University, and my area of research and teaching is kind of religion, politics, and theology. And I've contributed a piece on farming, grief, and hope. How do we reconcile the grief, especially among the farming community in India? And what are the ways forward in terms of nurturing hope?
Sure, I'm not going to cancel. Okay.
That's great. Thank you, Anderson. And Grace, if you could introduce yourself next.
So hi everyone, I'm Grace. I am a Church of England priest in Manchester, and the chapter that I wrote for the book was a feminist reflection on the effects of the climate emergency on women, particularly thinking about some of the experiences of my family back in India, and looking through the sort of lens of Eve and how Eve could speak into this and stand in solidarity with women today.
Thank you. And finally, last but not least, Maria.
Thank you. I hope that you can hear me. My name is Maria. I am Ecuadorian. I live in Ecuador, and I work in Tiran as the Theology and Network Engagement Global Lead. My chapter, first of all, I'm very privileged, and I feel very honored of being part of this book and contributing with such a lovely and committed and engaging, challenging people as you are. My chapter provides a reflection from a decolonial perspective from Latin America, and I try to make a dialogue between some indigenous communities in Latin America, which was called Abya Yala before the arrival of the colonizers. So trying to make a dialogue on how the creation narratives are similar in so many ways, emphasizing actually that humanity was like human beings were soil as everything else in the creation, and how actually trying to make things different and thinking about alternatives can bring us to learn from what indigenous communities used to live and used to act and used to live. So how can we learn from them, and how can we also embrace lament in a way that it can help us to convert and transform and flourish in a way? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maria. That's a really great summary of your contribution. While we're waiting for all of the questions to inevitably flood into the chat, because you will all have loads of things you'd like to ask these panelists, maybe you could, a couple of you wouldn't mind kicking us off with being willing to talk a little bit perhaps about your experience of writing your contribution to the book, whether it influenced the ways you thought theologically about climate and ecological grief, whether you thought about it in a new way, or whether now that we're a year on from those first ideas that you thought about, whether you would say anything differently now, or want to add to what you wrote in light of the last year, or in light of a change in your thinking. Would any of you be willing to kick us off with that?
Shall I start, Hannah? Yeah. Okay. Well, I was just really thinking about this, the process of writing, and also since having read other people's contributions too, and reflected on grief really. And I think for me, what this has helped to do is shape some of my theological perspective on grief, and it's helped me to really remind me of how we're created in community and in relationship, and this can be seen in the way that we grieve. So there was one chapter, I think, which was based in South Africa, where the authors talked about how grieving in a community can be transformative. And I was also in a recent discussion of about compost, of all things. And I had in this image during this discussion was this image of, if we break down together, if we grieve together and break down together, the compost of our grief is richer than if we break down apart. There's something really quite transformative in communal grief. So for me, theologically, having gone through this, I'm looking really at communal grief practices, communal climate grief practices, liturgies and spaces where we can come together to grieve.
Thank you, Grace. Anderson, were you waving as well?
Yeah, no, it was a very interesting process of writing, because what I tried to capture in my chapter was an experience that belonged to about 15 years ago, and also not physically being present in India when I was writing this, very far away. And I was writing it during the pandemic, and we couldn't travel. And so it was a very interesting experience of taking yourself away from your current locatedness, and then put yourself and reimagine, and also bring to mind all those experiences that actually gave me the idea to write. So when I wrote it, I didn't realize, particularly now since finishing this chapter, then thinking about, I didn't quite realize the gravity of the situation right across the Anglican Communion. Of course, I wrote it from a very small province of the Anglican Communion in South India, but then only to later realize that the problems that I try to highlight is common to pretty much about, say, 38 provinces in the entire Anglican Communion. That is about, out of 48 provinces, at least 38 provinces are directly impacted in the way that I try to articulate from South India. So it was a very interesting experience. Now that even within this book itself, there has been several glimpses into that reality. So it was a very interesting way to look back, to tap into my previous experience, but then also, being oblivious to the reality of climate crisis and how farming community are impacted right across the globe. So probably I would have given a lot more thought in linking these experiences right across the globe. So certainly that is something that I've started thinking.
Thank you, Anderson. We have a specific question for Sophia. And Sophia, Susan Kimberly wanted to ask you, why were women and girls the main victims in the event you described? And I wonder if this might be an opportunity, Sophia, for you to share a little bit about some of that wider feminist perspective that shapes your work.
Thank you. As a feminist theologian, I noted that women and girls are always underprivileged, particularly here in Africa. And so because the community that was affected by Cyclone Idai in Chipinge and Chimanimani was basically a rural community and a peri-urban community, the majority of the residents were women and girls. And so as a result, they were the ones who carried the bigger burden. And most of the people who perished, like I highlighted earlier on, were women and girls. And because also they were not strong enough to swim or to walk to safety during the outbreak of the cyclone, they therefore carried the brunt of the burden. So it is something that needs to be given adequate attention, especially in times of disaster prevention and disaster mitigation. And I also noticed that there were lessons that were learned from Cyclone Idai, because around the festive season this past year in December 2020, there was also a threat for Cyclone Charlene in the same area in Chimanimani and Chipinge. And the government of Zimbabwe showed that it had learned some lessons by making efforts to repatriate the people before the outbreak of the cyclone. So at least the loss of life and loss of property was really reduced in 2020, unlike in 2019 when people died, got injured, were cut off from assistance because the roads, the communication networks had been disrupted due to the cyclone. So yes, women and girls were really the victims, and because of the socioeconomic advantages that they have been exposed to due to the patriarchal tradition, made them more susceptible to the effects of the cyclone.
Thank you, Sophia. We've got another question coming in from Helen. I wonder if Maria might be willing to start us off with this one, given some of the context of your chapter. Other than to each other, to whom are you looking for national and global leadership in the ecological situation in which we find ourselves? And then if another of you want to jump in as well, it'd be great to hear a couple of thoughts on that. Sorry to put you on the spot, Maria, but I wonder if you might be willing to start us off.
Okay, so to whom are we looking for national and global leadership in the ecological situation? I think that I have the feeling that we have this idea that big changes in humanity need to start or be led or directed by big politicians and big figures. Lately, more recently, I have actually develop more hope. I have much more hope, not in the big leadership, global national leadership, but actually in the small things, the power of the small, the transformative power of small communities and small things, small groups of people. So when we are talking about environment and climate grief, we tend to look to the COPs, we tend to look the agreement, the Paris Agreement, we tend to look to these big platforms where we actually haven't found everything that we were hoping for. So some other people that we have turned, at least in Latin America and in the groups that we are trying to mobilize from a faith-based perspective, we tend to look to the communities, indigenous communities, because they don't only have the speech and the discourse, they also have the way of life. They have the way of living, they have the way of acting, they have another alternative. So when we ask how do we do to continue producing, for example, but in good ways, how do we do to think about living, because it's not about erasing humanity from the surface of the earth. How do we do to still live, but in the same time protect and nurture the nature? They have been doing so for a long time. So we in Latin America, many of us, we tend to look to those who have already been doing the same thing, and they are not in the big platforms. They are not national and global leadership. They are a kind of different kind of leadership, but they do also have a voice. They have a life, and because of that, they provide us some alternatives.
Thank you, Maria. Does anyone else want to jump in on that question before we head on to another one? Yes, Anderson.
Yeah, no, I think this is something that I've reflected in my chapter as well. I think how the communities, just borrowing from the Latin American liberation theology, it's the base communities that's going to be the real instrument of change. I think for too long, I think we have been waiting for kind of messiahs to come from somewhere and lead us into kind of a revolution. But what is important, and if I could just reflect back on what's happening in India, is that thousands of farmers have taken matters on their own hand And now they have been launching a massive protest organized by the communities against the Indian government in India, protesting against the massive changes that the government is bringing that's going to affect directly the farming communities. So I think the local communities, individuals, they become the leaders. I think we have moved on in terms of imagining leadership from simply around individuals, but we need to think about how communities can come together and bring change from bottom up. And I think the only way we can redeem whatever is left of our life is through organic change that can come from the bottom up.
Thank you, Anderson. Emma, we have a question for you from Naomi, who would love to hear more about your work on soil and your main conclusions. And in particular, I'd be interested to hear, if I can add to Naomi's question, how working in soil and working on soil has shaped your understanding of your faith. In your piece in the book, you talk about soil as joining the past and the future. And I wonder if you could speak about how that's shaped your practice of your faith and whether that continues in your work in soil.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to respond to this question while also sort of picking up on threads that this conversation is already headed down the road with, about sort of like the tension between the local and the global. And what I think this book, I will just say, is really neat because, as I'm going through it, I'm picking up on these things, these points of connections that, like, as everybody speaks and investigates their local context, we're able to find each other in this language that was formerly like maybe inaccessible or a little bit hidden or a little bit obscured by the kind of focus on the scale of the problem. So thinking at different scales. So in working in soil, I mean, I think that with, I don't know, I mean, I guess theological reflections on climate change oftentimes become obscured by this focus on the kind of macro, and it can lead to these spaces of despairing grief, which, Hannah, you talk about in the introduction as well. So I guess in my experience working with soil and the kind of like compost process that Grace has also mentioned, it has allowed me to become a little bit more particular about the sites of my grief. So how is it that this land in particular that I work with and partner with sort of speaks to histories that have been forgotten? And as I work, what kinds of histories am I bringing about? What kinds of futures am I bringing about? So soil it's sort of like, also it helps me to think a little bit more about time as a circle, more than a line in the compost process, sort of like things coming back and things resurfacing. And the grieving process involves the sort of like resurfacing griefs and fears as a process of continued fertility, one hopes. But yeah, my piece also wrestles a little bit with this sort of like contaminated fertility and what it's like to be a human alive right now, who is sort of aware of one's complicity in problems that exceed our capacity to act, and what it means to sort of choose to go on in that context. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Emma. That's great. It leads us really nicely into a question from James, who wants to hear more on this idea of compostable grief, or grief as part of a kind of composting. He says it's strikes him as a very powerful force for repentance, that language of compostable or communal grief. It strikes me as well as an image that brings to mind resurrection, And I wonder if, Grace, if you'd be willing to say a little more about that, because you were the one who used the phrase, and then if anyone else wants to reflect as well after Grace, that would be great.
I find it really, I've become very interested in soil and compost. I am an absolutely hopeless gardener, so I find it quite interesting that this is something that I've started to focus on. But I was just really struck a lot of the reading I've done over the past year. And when you look at this collection that we've got of books, where there's a lot of voices coming together as a collective voice of grief, really, and it's together in this one book, there is a sense by which when we grieve together, as I've already said, we carry that burden between us, and we share that burden between us. And when we break down together, when we break down in grief together, what we can get from that can be much more transformative. The compost, the results of that breaking down can transform and bring hope. And I'm very conscious that I'm saying this at a time when we're in a global pandemic, where issues of grief and social distancing and not being able to grieve together in the same ways that we might have done before may raise issues in the future. One of the things that I love about where I serve is that I serve in an area that's got a very large Afro-Caribbean population, and I've done a lot of Afro-Caribbean funerals that can last for a day. So people come to churches before COVID, 200 or so people in church, singing, praying, grieving together. Everybody comes, and we all go to the grave together, and everybody continues singing and praying together, and we fill in the grave together. And it's an act of communal grief, but in that grief there is real hope. And I just see spaces for which this grief that we're all experiencing, a lot of us experiencing around the climate catastrophe that we are facing, maybe one way to find hope and transformation is to grieve together and as communities.
I wonder if anyone else wanted to jump in.
I can add something again from indigenous perspectives, and how me as a more urban, a woman from an urban setting, Christian, who learned not to honor and learn from indigenous, but rather to evangelize them and convert. So it has been a huge transformation personally and theologically. But among the things that I have learned is actually around grief, because in my evangelization, grief is actually not very popular and not very present. Grief is a place to feel bad, to be sad, not necessarily as this idea of compostable grief, something that can be transformed into something better, can be transformed into something that can give life. However, with the indigenous communities, grief is very important, and it's done in communities. So people get together, just like Grace was saying, as in a funeral, they get together, they are in the tent, in the house, because it's a common house, and they can stay there for days, many days, not only to grieve, but also to lament, but also to resolve problems. So it's a place where this compostage, if it's in English, like this compost phase takes place in community, and there is definitely healing that comes out from there. There is hope that comes out from that place of grieving in community. Deals with much more than crying, as I could imagine. There is celebration, there is chant, there is drama, there is memory, there is identity also around there, because all these elements can heal and can give hope, which is, I think, what needs to come when we grieve adequately. Hope and transformation.
Thank you so much, Maria. That's a really great place to bring this conversation to a close. Thank you so much to Emma, Maria, Sophia, Anderson, and Grace for sharing your thoughts this evening. And if you would like to hear more from all of them, then you can pick up a copy of the book and you can read their contributions.
And thank you to everyone who's written in questions or comments. It's been really lovely to have you as part of this conversation in the comment section, and they've been great questions to discuss. So I think we are now going to close the discussion panel, the sort of like Nicola's all-powerful behind the scenes work. We'll close that down, and I'm going to share with you, before we hear from David Benjamin Blower, I'm going to share with you a short extract from the conclusion to the book, which I entitled World Without End. And in part, it's a reflection on that phrase from our liturgy, particularly from the Anglican communion's tradition. But I wanted to share some reflections at the end about what grief means when we also claim resurrection. I am not suggesting that grieving a dying world as a Christian is all that different to the grief of someone who does not believe our destruction will be redeemed. We share common griefs, even though our experiences are shaped by the particular places to which we belong. Grief is, for all of us, a means of survival, a healthy way to deal with immense suffering. It prevents us from becoming bitter or closed off or indifferent. Grief, especially when shared with others, can make us more generous, tender people. And I think we grieve in order to be honest about how things are and how we are. So much of the death around us springs from gainful dishonesty. Dishonesty about the sanctity of each creature, dishonesty about the likely consequences of our actions, and covering up those consequences when they happen. If we cannot bring ourselves to be truthful about our broken histories or the current trauma we face and perpetuate, we cannot begin to heal. Survival, compassion, honesty, these are all good reasons to grieve. But the conviction that Christ's resurrection marked the death of death also contains the hope that our works of love in the present are not consigned to destruction. They participate in a transformed future. As this book took shape, I became increasingly convinced that grief is not only a response to losing something loved, or a motivator for behaving in loving ways, but a work of love itself. I found myself wanting to put words to something that feels so mysterious as to be unspeakable, that our grief over a dying world is more than compassion or repentance. It is also a work that transforms us and the world around us. As love, our grief is shaped, but not constrained by the places and time we are given. It is able to stretch beyond our own worlds, our own self-help mantras, our own comforts, even into the ages of ages. Prophecies, tongues, and knowledge will all come to an end, but love never ends. It is not that our expressions of love are full or healed. Now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. But nevertheless, our grief, like the world it loves, is not wasted. Reading these stories of grief and courage, of love, has been a dark glass through which I anticipate the one and the world I long to see face to face. It is humbling to begin with those things that are lost and broken as my blurred window for truth about the world. But if the body of Christ is a place where I can learn to look through the glass, then that is what I am trying to do, knowing I do not look alone. The world is not indifferent to pain, and nor is the one who made it, and who will make it whole. These pages gather our shared longing to describe this grief, reveal the love that burns at its heart, and offer the courage to pursue it. I do not intend to sanctify trauma or treat suffering as necessary for love, but we are currently unable to love the world without being willing to expose ourselves to the pain of its death. And grief contains power. If we do not learn how to grieve as a work of love, we will continue to hurt one another. I have coexisted for a long time with the kind of crushing sadness which compels me to worship at the altar of my own despair, feeding hungrily on tears for their own sake, offering up sorrow which does not love life so much as it loves its own abyss. I know the consequences of grieving badly, and I know that I am still trying to learn to grieve well. Becoming open to the grief of others, rather than imagining I grieve alone, turns me out of myself. It is teaching me to practice the kind of grief which sings that the world is both dying and being made, and made over again by love. Thank you for reading with me. The world that love makes is a world without end. Look through the glass darkly, and be assured that our grief will not be wasted. Thank you for joining us this evening, and we are now going to hear from David Benjamin Blower.
Good evening. I hope that sounds okay. I hope you can hear me. It's very wonderful to be involved and to be part of this gathering of voices in the book and this evening, and to see people's faces as well. I'm going to play a poem of sorts and then a song. And the poem is called "The Floor," and it owes something to the philosopher Timothy Morton, who Hannah Malcolm quoted from at the beginning of this event. So it's inspired by something he wrote in the book, Being Ecological, about sitting with grief until you fall through into perhaps into wonder. And so will we fall through all our troubled sleep and awaken to panic, guilt and dread. And then will we fall through the floor once more, and then into tears and laughter instead. And wonder and sorrow over everything that is, how much it matters in ecstatic clarity and madness. And every thread of this dread comedy of foolishness, that we really existed and we really did this. And nothing can be undone, only tended or forgiven. And then shall we open our small clenched fists and hold out palms of powerless thankfulness for everything that we received was gift, and so much love and wonder in our midst. And finally stand we all in defeated awe at everything that is and was and shall be evermore. We know that the whole of creation has been groaning in the labor pains until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit grown inwardly while we wait. In the hope that creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay. Do not be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. Put your hands in the soil, feel the groan, feel the joy, or sit with the hurt, stare into the dirt, occupy the bandstands, gather lost citizens, climb down your pyramids, relinquish your privilege, welcome strangers to your table, as though they were angels, sit with the spent, feel the lament, break your vows to the powers, plant trees and grow flowers, share the resources, free all the horses. All citizens, put your hands in the soil and feel the groan. Can you feel the joy? And be still, and be still. Down by the riverside, who's not afraid to die? rise from the waves, broke loose from the powers of the age. Live now as citizens of what's left of the age to come. Behold the Messiah dying for the lands we're crucifying. Break bread and take drink, all feel and think, shed tears every day for everything we throw away. Mourn for your families, mourn for your enemies, sing to the stars, console our grieving hearts. All citizens, put your hands in the soil and feel the ground. Can you feel the joy? And be still, and be still. Put your hand to your mouth, let your pride go south. Put your hands on your head, make terms with the dead. Put your hands on your face, too late to learn from our mistakes. Put your hand on your heart, can we stop what we start? Sisters to the leverage, brothers to the edges, youth to the fore, this bleak future is yours. All ye of noble birth, join the scum of the earth. Gather round the powerless, for theirs is the power that can save us. All citizens, put your hands in the soil and feel the ground. Can you feel the joy? And be still, and be still. And be still, and be still, and be still, and be still.
Well, thank you so much. We're going to close in a minute. I just wanted to say a big thank you to all our contributors for the part you've played this evening, and to Hannah, ultimately for curating the evening and actually just for pulling together the book. And also to you for tuning in. And if you've liked what you've heard this evening, then just in case you hadn't picked up on it, on the 30th of January, there'll be another panel based around the book in a larger event, which we've called How to Rage. And there's going to be a host of other themes, as well as climate grief, that are going to be addressed in that. We've got Azariah, who we heard from earlier, is speaking. He's going to be talking about raging against institutions, and another of the contributors actually to Words for a Dying World, Gione Javier, is one of the speakers there too. So please don't miss it. It'll be well worth it, I think. And there's also music and poetry as part of that as well. So it'll have quite a similar flavour, I think, to this evening. So that's on the 30th of January. Tickets available via scmpress.co.uk, where you got your tickets. If you booked in for this, you'll know where the events tab is on our website. And you'll see the details there. And just a reminder as well that you can get 20% off the book. You use the code WFADW20 and go to our website, scmpress.co.uk, and then just use the code in the checkout. There's a slide at the end of this, I think. So if you've missed all those details, just hang on and you'll see the details there. You'll be able to buy a copy of the book for 20% off, and also free postage and packaging if you're in the UK. And so I think that's everything. I'm just going to close now. And Hannah's asked me just to read a closing benediction by Maggie Dawn, which comes at the end of the book. Maggie, unfortunately, couldn't be with us this evening. But let me just read this on her behalf now as we go. Sorrows may surround you, sadness overwhelm you, yet be confident of this, that you shall see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. And now may this God, who holds you in trouble, tends you in sorrow, and leads you to green pastures, this 3 in 1 and 1 in 3 God, bless you and bless you and bless you.